So I'm with Michelle Ashford at her office at Sony, where Masters of Sex gets written.
It does, right here.
So how many writers do you have in your writer's room, the room you run?
Well, it varies, but we actually have a full room right now. We have about 6 writers, myself included, and it's a nice group. It's a nice crowded table. Lots
How does
of
it
opinions.
work? You're the last word, but how do you keep the writers open and creative and how does that, how do you manage that? You worked your way up through all these different writers' rooms. You're one of those.
I did. I'm one of the old school folks. I came up from the very beginning as a baby writer, and so I've seen writing staffs from every point of view, and I've worked with people who are wonderful at running rooms and some that are not. So I think one of the things is that everyone gets a voice and everyone is equal in that room. Yes, at the end of the day, if you have to make a decision, it'll come down to me. But we have a very complicated show. You wouldn't think it. You would just think, oh, it has a little bit of science and some soap opera elements. But for some reason, our show is very, very hard to write. So what I do find is everybody is working so hard to figure these stories out and what's the right tone and how do we approach them, that everyone's so busy with the work of it that we don't really have time for who's getting what idea in or who's winning in the room or anything like that. We're all just, our brains are sort of turned into pretzels trying to figure these episodes out every year. So
you've done 3 full seasons.
Yes, 3 full seasons.
How many episodes is that?
Well, it was 12 each, so we got 36 so far, which is
That's
a
lot.
lot. Is a lot.
I'm going to jump right in with one of my biggest question, which is, in this particular case with Masters and Johnson, you've been asked this question before, but it's a real story, it's a true story. We know they end up together. So the trick here, and it seems to be a real balancing act, as you say, and it may be what makes what you do so difficult, is how to elongate the story, how to extend it, and
that's true.
Still make it compelling, even though we know where it's going to end up.
Well, that's true, and I knew this from the very beginning, as I thought, wow, this is a really odd problem, because a 5-second Google will tell you what happened. So the what happened is not going to be what compels people to watch the show. So what I thought would, though, is the how does it happen. So if you make the journey curious enough so you can't imagine, for example, how did these 2 people end up together, that would be hopefully interesting enough. And certainly the stuff that we're exploring as we go on along the way in terms of intimacy and sex, and hopefully that's interesting enough. But for example, the fact that they do end up married, and I think a lot of people know that now. So we ended season 3 with them completely estranged and her going off to marry someone else. So then you would think, well, how did that happen? And it by the way, it's true.
That's what I want to know. Did it really happen?
She got very close to marrying a guy who was a perfume magnate, ran a scent company, and it was a real turning point in their relationship and her life. And she didn't do it. And so, but that's how we ended season 3, which was, with her in the crux of that sort of decision, and Masters thinking all is lost. All is lost. And so, yes, that's fun, and I love the fact that that's true. It got really down to the wire for her.
What was interesting about season 3, at least for me, is I am rooting for them to get together. I am very invested in it. When they actually do have one of their sort of sessions,
right.
Which it still boggles the mind, the way that they kind of rationalize all of this, and the degree to which they're both in denial about what's really going on. You're allowing these very smart people, partly because of the period, presumably, because they're not self-aware
in this way. Well, very few people. It's not like it is now, when everyone has their head shrunk to the size of a pin. And therapy was just not something that everybody did in those days. And I do think that there was a lot of denial about behavior and sort of compartmentalized lives. Not that that doesn't happen now, by the way, but it was, I think, just a different way of being. I even know in my own family, earlier generations just would not talk about things or not mention certain things, and everything was sort of under the surface. And then certainly the 60s and the 70s came along and everything exploded. And their work, oddly, was one of the sort of cornerstones of this revolution in terms of frank discussion, honesty about sex, a lack of self-consciousness about your body. All this was happening where they were personally living such odd lives. And so this is one of the things that I always thought was so fascinating about this story. So but they don't continue in this state forever. It is a thing that is really in motion, and how these characters are changing individually, it really comes to the fore in this season, this fourth season.
So will this be the last season?
Well, it's not entirely up to me. I am starting to talk to David Nevins and certainly the people at Sony about this. I think it's lovely when when shows get to know when their ending is so that they can plan for it. So,
but did you plan for the ending this is what fascinates me too, because the first season was so novel. I mean, I'd really never seen a show like this.
Oh, that's nice.
And the character of Virginia, this woman who is really sort of embodying the new awareness of what women could do in the workplace,
right.
and so on. And I just, it was really fun to watch the whole thing unfold. But did you know how long you had to take to get to the end point?
Well, it's really curious. As I said, this is not just a decision up to me. It's a business decision. It involves big studios and companies and financial stuff. So, but I read the book and I thought I very clearly see 4 seasons. And I thought if they asked me to go longer, I could do that. If they said go 10 seasons, that would be sort of insurmountable. But I could see how I could stretch it from 4 a little bit. So we'll see where we go. I mean, I really do think the best way to do it, if it's possible, is just for all of us to know what we're doing so that we can really plan for it. When I read the book, I did think, you need to have an ending in mind for this. And so I've been thinking about it from the very beginning.
And you've been toying with us, because I have to say the relationship with Josh Charles, the perfume guy, was the most satisfying one that Virginia has had.
Right.
He even if he isn't perfect, and it culminates for those who've seen the whole series in this extraordinary dinner.
Yes.
That was fun.
Good. I'm glad. Yes, I thought that was great. Every once in a while we do these episodes where it's much more play-like, and they're always really fun, and we've done it now several times, and we're doing another one this year as well. And it's just kind of getting to settle in and just watch the dynamics, and very much like a piece of theater. And that lovely Judy Greer, who played his wife, is actually... we might see her again. And, yes. So anyway, there's lots of fun things. We have a tendency to, once we find people we love, to always bring them back, which has been one of the great joys of this show, actually.
Well, the other joys of the show are the costumes, the production design.
Yes.
And what decision did you make that was odd in terms of period jumping?
Well, we did, one of the things that had not been entirely sorted out when we started this. I mean, when they picked it up, I thought, I see the first season very clearly. I can see where it begins and where it ends, and it had a sort of odd parallel to kind of a year's worth of time, more or less. And I thought, okay, that's fine. But then I thought, if we're going to actually move through this story and they're going to keep renewing us, then something has to give, because to hit sort of the highlights of their lives and their careers, we're going to have to move faster through time. So I had not sorted this out, so that second year was a little bit trial and error in terms of what are we going to do about time. And so we took one episode. We knew we had to move like 3 years. We took one episode and decided to actually move in that episode. So it starts in 1958 and ends up in 1961. And we did it in one episode. And so it was an experiment. I mean, some people thought it was great. I think some people were scratching their heads. But this is a great thing about TV. Every episode doesn't have to be perfect. You're trying. And that's actually fun, and so it was the episode that nearly killed all of us, both as writers and as actors.
Which one was that?
It was 207, so it was right in the middle of the second season, and you realized, and we used a sort of visual device of Libby continually walking up the stairs in that office, and she would start the stairs in one year, and by the time she got to the top, she was in another year, and you could tell by she'd be holding another child, for example. And you just had to sort of go with it. We also used a slate because Lester is filming everything. And in the slate, he changes the year every time. So we thought, well, either people will just hang with it and think this is really cool, or just be confused.
You can do whatever you want.
Well, that is the fun of television.
Yeah, but then you took another leap this season.
You mean the third season? Yes. So we now we've decided. So we tried that experiment.
You have the fourth season coming.
Yes, we do have the fourth season coming, and so we're now very sort of loose with time because we actually found that being incredibly faithful to exactly the dates and it was just actually paralyzing story-wise. So now our things very loose. So for example, season 4 starts in 69 and will end in 71, but you will not feel it like you did in that second season, which was like, okay, we're telling you exactly how we're moving. It'll be a much more gentle sort of amorphous kind of moving, and hopefully that actually works for people. We'll see.
A creep.
Well,
Mad Men did that.
Yes.
They moved around quite a bit.
They did
and made from season to season. You made big leaps.
Right.
So the other question I have is are you also working on Lewis and Clark now?
Well, Lewis and Clark is a really curious and long journey, a journey far longer trying to make that miniseries than the actual journey across the country that the men took. I've been working on that for 10 years and worked very steadily on it for 6. And then there was a lot of stuff that happened sort of behind the scenes, and I moved away from it. And it continued, though, in some form, but it didn't work out. So they shut it down, and they are rebooting it. And so, because I love that story so deeply, and I've invested so much time and energy into it, I said I would love to come back and be part of this sort of redoing of it. So, yes, I am doing that.
You're more in charge now.
It's less people involved. I will just say that.
I would say working with Edward Norton was probably a challenge. He's a very bright guy who thinks he's the smartest person in the world.
You've met him.
And he could be.
He's very, very smart, very talented, and look at it was sad. There was this grand design at some point that he was also producing it with Brad Pitt's company, and they had loved this story for many, many years since they worked together on Fight Club. And the idea would be that they would be in it as Lewis and Clark. And so that's sort of the beginning of the thing sort of falling apart, was what, obviously Brad didn't do it, and then Edward didn't do it, and then so a lot of things happened. So anyway.
So as I understand it, you're in process of rewriting the whole thing, which must be massive.
It is, but I do know the story very well. I did write 8 episodes of it already, and it's not as daunting, no pun intended, as one might think, because I've actually put a ton of time into it. So it's sort of reimagining the puzzle pieces a bit, but it isn't starting from scratch, which I couldn't possibly do and do this show at the same time. So.
No, that makes sense. So where are you with season 4?
So we're shooting our second episode right now. We finished production on September 27th, I believe, and we're on the air on September 11th.
Wow.
I know.
Wow.
I know. So we're going to be pedaling fast at the end.
And so what would the imaginary timeline for Lewis and Clark be, do you think?
It's whenever I can fit it in the 5 minutes of downtime.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a lot.
That's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
So the casting was remarkable because back to Masters of Sex, part of what I find fascinating about Michael Sheen's Mr. Dr. Masters, is he's so awful in so many ways, and so dense, and so sexist, and all the things that you would think, but then you like him anyway, and you care about him.
Well, a lot of that is a tribute to Michael, who's just such an extraordinary actor. He really is. And also, I really do credit him with being brave enough to, at the beginning, we talked about different ways this could go, and he was quite committed to really telling the story of what happens to someone who has endured terrible abuse and has had no therapy, no counseling, nothing around it. And by the way, that was all very true of the real man. He did have a horrific sort of upbringing, and as a result, he was imprisoned in this sort of armor, and it kept him away from people, the inability to sort of connect, difficulties with intimacy. And I believe all this was true. And then he met Virginia, and there was something about her, some sort of ineffable kind of quality that started to unlock this. And so the journey for him has been to shed these sort of layers of armor. And it has been a messy one, as it would be for anyone having to sort of relearn how to be a human. And this season is quite remarkable in that respect. Because he makes a real, I know the term now pivot is being used in politics every 5 minutes, but the character of Masters is certainly doing a pivot, as they say, in this season. It's quite interesting to watch, I think.
And Lizzie Kaplan is remarkable, and she's grown.
Yes, she's also remarkable. When you read the book, something becomes very clear. It's a little bit like they've switched roles by the end of their lives. And how this happened, and it was very clear that they influenced each other and affected each other deeply in this way, but they a little bit cross paths and then each go the opposite direction. And so this is one of the things we're really looking at this season. She ended her life in a very curious way, and I don't think entirely sanguine about things that had happened and about where she was. And in an odd way, she's sort of more bedeviled by demons than he is at the end, oddly.
Something to look forward to,
yes.
I must say.
Yeah.
What was the real time span then?
They were 30 years. They spent 30 years, I think. Well, they met in 56, I believe. And he died in 2003. And they were divorced by then for a while. I think they'd been divorced maybe 10, 15 years by that point. But they were together, married and working together for 30 years.
Wow.
And by the way, still actually, after they divorced, they still would do things together, and they would still... So it was a very intense. And when I read the book, I thought, this is the weirdest, most fascinating relationship I've ever run across. And I really still believe that. It's really strange.
Well, it's given you plenty to work with, but
Yeah.
I must confess that it is their relationship that I am most interested in.
Well, I think all of our sort of smartest watchers have a tendency to say that. It's like, we really, really just want to know what is going on with those two, and so we're diving into that this season for sure.
So was the sexuality of the series, because it isn't, I mean, sometimes it is very sexy, actually, it is, but there's a lot of other sex that's very clinical and
Right.
and very strange
And very unsexy.
and bizarre, yes.
Yes.
Was that a real selling point for Showtime when you first were pitching this? See, I was curious about I know we're going back to the beginning, but I never interviewed you before, so this is my chance.
No, that's fine.
I mean, what was the pitching process for this?
Well, it was remarkably easy, thank goodness, because first of all, I hate pitching. It makes me deeply uncomfortable. And both my producing partner, Sarah Timmerman, and I both know David Nevins. And he had just gotten the job at Showtime. And we were talking to other people. We talked to HBO, we talked to FX. And Sarah ran into David at an airport, and she had the book in her bag. She goes, "You got to read this right now." And he read it on the plane, and he got off and he said, "I get it." So I think, yes, the sex of it was appealing, but not in the way you might think, because David immediately understood the idea of looking at sex through a scientific lens was weird and fascinating and fresh. And so I actually think they've never said, "Oh, make it hotter," or anything like that. Make it super sexy. And and perfect bodies or anything like that, because I think they knew from the beginning that if we were going to do sex, doing it this way was the least unusual and would make people go, huh, I've never seen sex like that before. And I knew I also could only do it if we did it that way. So,
how many characters have you developed for the series who are not based on reality at all?
Well, one of the things we've done is we've taken characters and put them together sort of in pieces. So, for example, Barton Scully, Master's mentor, sort of amalgam of 3 men that were in and around his life. One of those men was a closeted gay man, and Masters figured that out later in his life, that that's sort of the thing that had bedeviled this particular man. But it is a composite of other characters, so we have a tendency to put people together that way. When we put Barton together as sort of a composite of real life characters, then we thought, well, he needs a wife. Once we realized we were going to go down this path,
that was a rich reward.
Oh, it
Alice
was
and
just,
Danny.
but honestly, this was so not planned. And once we thought, well, he needs a wife if we're going to go on this weird journey with him, then we thought, well, who would be, obviously she's the best, actress imaginable. So we thought, ooh, what if we could get her? And then, so then we just ended up on this odd journey. So she is completely fabricated, but once we knew that he was going to be closeted, we thought, God, what would it be like to be a woman married to a man like that and actually not know? And then the whole thing just kind of sprung from that.
She became the embodiment of all women who are clueless about sex, of which there were at that time many.
A ton.
And probably still are.
A ton, yeah.
Yeah. It's true. Okay. I think we've done it. I am very pleased. I look forward to what you do with. I mean, it must be sort of. I cannot wait to see what you do with this season. It must be strange to have HBO and Showtime having to be getting along with each other, because somebody's saying, "Where's the thing?" and someone else is saying, "This is what we're paying for."
I will say about HBO, they have their own stuff going on.
This is true.
And I think this has been such a long gestating project that they understand that. I'll get to it when I get to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being such a good watcher. I really